The research that we published in PeerJ looks into the effect of noise pollution on bird behavior. Specifically, we looked at the effects of anthropogenic noise, so human-caused noise, on parental care behaviors in Western bluebirds. The main behavior that we wanted to look at in this paper was provisioning behavior. So when a parent provides their offspring with food, because it is so crucial for those behaviors to occur to support life. So in this paper, we did two separate studies. In the first study, birds were exposed to traffic noise as well as a silent playback for about an hour. And then we also had a different study in which birds were exposed to noise throughout their entire nesting cycle. For the first study, the short term playback study, what we did is we went to individual nest boxes and we either played a silent track or we broadcasted traffic noise to these birds. And we recorded what the bird's behavior was. So, how many times the bird came back and provisioned for its young, and whether those provisioning attempts were successful. And what we found from doing these short term experiments was that in our second trials, birds were provisioning less often when they were exposed to the noise. So, they were giving their offspring food less. We also found that there were more failed feeding attempts when the birds were exposed to noise. So the parents would bring food for their offspring, but they would fail to actually deliver it to their bills. The second thing that we did in this paper was look at how birds respond to noise when they have noise present throughout their entire nesting cycle. So to do this, we went to a habitat that has these gas and oil compressors throughout it, and basically had this nest box system at different distances away from these gas and oil compressors in order to achieve a gradient of noise levels. And what we found from examining the bird's behavior in this system was actually the opposite effect of what we had expected. So in this system, birds were provisioning more frequently when it was louder, so in higher amplitudes. And not only that, we actually found that birds are returning to their nest box more quickly after a disturbance, so our nest check, in those noisy areas. So they're not only provisioning more when it's louder, but they're also coming back to the nest box sooner. So again, it was the complete opposite of the trends that we expected to find, and it was also the opposite trend of what was occurring when we exposed birds to noise in the short term.
The results that we present in this paper are important because we found strong evidence that noise pollution affects how parent birds feed for their nestlings. But the really interesting part of our study is that we found diverging effects. Noise decreased nestling feeding rates in our short term experiments, but parents that were raising their chicks in noise polluted environments actually had higher nestling feeding rates than parents in relatively quiet areas. This difference was surprising, and it could be due to differences in bluebird populations in the two areas. But we also think that it could indicate that short term experiments don't capture the complexity of living in a really noisy place. In these really noisy locations, the broader community of predators and competitors have shifted, which could explain some of the changes. And individual birds that experience constant noise also have changes to their circulating stress hormones.
There are a couple of lessons that I think can be taken away from this paper. One is more about our impact as humans as a whole. A lot of people definitely think more of the physical pollutants that we're putting out into the world, but they're not necessarily thinking of how we can be altering an animal's ability to hear and just the cascading effects that can have on the ecosystem as well as animal behavior. The second lesson that I think is important to learn from this paper is because of the fact that we had these diverging effects when we looked at these two different experiments, is that short term experiments might not always adequately capture the complexities happening in the ecosystem. And so we need to take those into consideration when we're extrapolating or generalizing our results from our short term experiments. Because ecology is complex and there's many different factors that can be influencing um, an animal's behavior.